you alluded to how much of the budget, how much of our deficit, or sorry, I apologize, how much of our debt is not really on budget. If you take our on-budget debt, our intergovernment debt, and our off-budget liabilities, contingent liabilities, as a percentage of GDP, roughly, what is our debt?
I'd have to get back to you. I think the biggest component of off-balance sheet is the unfunded Medicare liabilities, 75 years, which is a tremendous number, and more than 30 trillion, something like that. According to the Medicare trustees, that assumes essentially continuation of the increased costs we see in healthcare delivery out into the indefinite future.
So at 100% of GDP on budget, we could be at 300 or 400% of GDP, including what's off budget.
As I said, if we don't make any changes to our current fiscal trajectory, it's definitely not sustainable.
Well, Secretary Geithner, and I'm only entering this subject because he brought it up, talked about these costs being small. But isn't it true that America already spends a bigger percentage of GDP than our European allies do on health care? In other words, we already are more generous in health care in the sense of what we spend, maybe not what we get for our money. Secretary is absolutely right. More than half of all health care is paid for outside of government. But it doesn't mean that what's paid for in government isn't already larger than what Canada pays in government for total health care. Isn't that right?
Not sure about the government comparison, but it is true that the United States spends more total on health care as a share of GDP than other industrial countries.
Well, I'd like to go on to, looking at that for a couple of reasons. There's been a lot of discussion about austerity, and this brings it back home a little bit. I'm an Art Laffer economic model guy. I'm not a Keynesian, clearly. But I think we can all understand, I knew that was good for a laugh, Peter. We can all understand that all economists tend to believe that there's probably a sweet spot, in other words, a right balance of public and private spending, a right balance, and so on. As we talk about austerity in Greece or in Portugal or in any country, and we talk about austerity here, and particularly, Mr. Secretary, aren't we agreeing that we're trying to get to the same position, whatever that sweet spot is of promoting growth through not taking it all to the government, and that we're only debating, when you talk about the rate of austerity, we're not debating where we need to get to. Where we need to get to so that the private sector can flourish is probably very similar to where we're telling the countries of Europe to get to, so that the difference of what the austerity we ask for others and the austerity we need to get to may be about how much time we have to get there more than it is about what we need to achieve. Isn't that true?
I think that's probably right. The fundamental reality, the fundamental constraint we all have to live with, whether you're European or American or Japanese, is you have to get the deficit down to a point where the debt stops growing as the share of the economy starts to decline, and you have to stabilize at a level that's acceptable.
Right, and I want to follow up with that just for the record.
The difference is, just on your first question, is it's partly a debate about how fast and what's appropriate, but it's also a debate about the composition. And the composition, if you look at what divides the country now,
the left and the right will never agree on where government should spend / invest. So we'll assume that part is probably very, very much ours. Chairman Bernanke, you'd already, I think, provided a little bit of a mea culpa, and I'm not going to ask for it again. But you put out a white paper related to the housing and what banks and so on should do. And if you don't mind, I'd like to follow up to a great extent in support of the ranking member. In your white paper, and again, your representative from Richmond, Virginia, and others may have chastised over this, but since it's out there in the record, one of the things that was in the white paper had to do with the possibility that banks should essentially flip their properties into rentals, that was an element. And the ranking member, very disciplined, talked about principal reduction. When we're looking at what is best for people who find themselves in homes that they could not originally afford, I mean, principal reduction in these low-interest times assumes that they can no longer or could not, when they bought the home, afford what they bought. When we look at the potpourri of options, both for the Freddie and Fannie and FHA and for the banks in their roles, would you comment further for this committee, on the record, to try to understand why these alternatives of perhaps you can't afford the rent for this home for a period of time, perhaps that's the best transition, perhaps it's best for the community. I think that's an element that has not been discussed, if you will, by the left or the right, and you did put it in your paper, and to the extent that it exists, I'd like to have it fully vetted.
The theme was that we need to attack the housing issue at different points. Obviously, if we can avoid unnecessary and uneconomic foreclosures, we should do that, and there are multiple ways of doing that. We didn't come down in favor of any specific approach. I think it depends on the situation. But what we noted was that no matter how hard we work, and the country's been working pretty hard on this issue, that there are going to be still a number of foreclosures that occur. People who lose their homes or leave their homes, investors who abandon their properties. And it's bad for the housing market, it's bad for neighborhoods, for empty houses to stand, you know, in a row on a street. So we still think that we should be looking at ways to avoid unnecessary and uneconomic foreclosures. But another part of the problem is the fact that we've got so many empty houses, overhanging supply in the housing market, which pushes down prices and reduces construction. So there are various possible approaches to that. One of them is REO to rental, which we described and talked about in our paper. There are other things for houses that are in bad condition. Land banks can purchase them and perhaps bulldoze them if necessary. So our point is only that loan modifications have a role to play, but there's a whole number of different things that can be helpful in the housing market.
Okay, and I'll give the ranking member some additional time if you'd like it, but I want to follow up with one more. And this is much more broadly in your purview, both of you. A number of cities, even states, have found ways to extend dramatically the amount of time it takes to foreclose on somebody that isn't paying. In Brooklyn, where we were, they basically got it out to 3 years if your papers are all in order between the time someone stops paying and perhaps stops maintaining the home and the time that the institution can take possession. In the case of Illinois, I'm sorry, the gentleman is not here right now, they've tried to have Freddie and Fannie, during the foreclosure process, which is being elongated, maintain the home on behalf of the homeowner who's not maintaining it on behalf of the community. I don't want to presume your answer, but would you say that these are probably not helpful to either the long-term credit market or because of certainty, or to the process that we're trying to get beyond and get to where we have a positive market and positive neighborhoods? And feel free to answer as you think is appropriate.
Well, I think delay for the sake of delay is not constructive. The homes deteriorate. The process drags on, and the healing of the housing market drags on. That being said, obviously we've seen a lot of cases where servicers have not performed their due diligence, where they have foreclosed inappropriately, et cetera, and where there are situations where there are questions about the integrity of the process, then we have to take the time necessary to make sure that things are being done correctly.
Yes, Mr. Secretary.
I think the chairman said it right. There are, of course, huge numbers of innocent victims in this crisis, and there are lots of people who can afford to stay in their homes, and you want to make sure you give them a chance to do it. And there are some people that have already left their homes or need to pursue a more affordable option, and we should help make that easy for them to do it. And you want to make sure that when you foreclose, that process has complete integrity. And so you want to have some checks and balances on that. But I agree with you that the process is taking too long in many parts of the country. And if that could be sped up without compromising those other fundamental objectives, that would probably be better for those communities.
Thank you. Mr. Cummings.